afternoon, and thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Welcome to this afternoon's MACRI Talk Tardeada, which is sponsored by AARP Texas. We are joined today by Dr. Carlos Blanton at the MACRI Visitor Center, and we're happy to have an in-person audience here at the center today, as well as online folks. Hello out there. For those of you participating virtually today, please let us know where you're joining from in the comments. For everybody, today is our last MACRI talk of the year. I hope you've been enjoying these talks, and I encourage you to check out our YouTube page to see all of our previous MACRI talks. You can also visit our website to see our calendar of upcoming programs. You can also subscribe to our e-newsletter and receive emails updating you on programs throughout the year. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Carlos Blanton, Professor of History at Texas A&M University. He's a researcher on Mexican American educational history and the author of numerous books and scholarly articles, including The Strange Career of Bilingual Education in Texas, 1836 to 1981, and George I. Sánchez, The Long Fight for Mexican American Integration, which copy here today. Thank you for that. He holds a PhD from Rice University. Today, Dr. Blanton will be talking about an important, though sometimes controversial, Mexican American civil rights leader, George I. Sánchez. And after his presentation, we'll have some time for audience questions. So those of you in the audience, if you'll just raise your hand, we'll call on you. And for those of you watching virtually, if you type your questions into the chat, we'll be able to see those, and we'll get to those as we can. Let's see. We'll get started now. And again, at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for some audience questions and comments. So, Dr. Blanton, if I could invite you to the podium.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, MACRI supporters who are out there in the internets, and thank you, MACRI supporters, here in this beautiful home in San Antonio. My name is Carlos Blanton. I'm a professor of history at Texas A&M University. Today, the news a lot, so I thought I should mention the maroon. If you want to get $77 million to, not coach anymore, A&M's the place for you, apparently. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your weekend to come here to listen to me talk about Dr. George I. Sánchez. I was mentioning to Carla a little bit earlier, this research project took about a decade of my life. Actors, they live and they breathe their role, the person they're playing, for weeks, maybe months, and then they play it, and maybe that takes weeks or months if you're making a movie, and then it's over, and then they move on. And as a historian, spending years going through those archives, spending years with this elderly Chicano gentleman in my head, informing the way I see the world, it really is a pleasure to talk about him. I can talk for hours. I'm not going to, I promise. I'm not going to. I will try to keep this short enough to allow for some questions afterwards. But the talk today, as you can see on the slides, Carla, thank you, is George I. Sánchez for Mexican American. It is essentially the same title as my book. Next slide, please. And I brought a copy of the book here. I was gauche enough to put the Amazon link. Once upon a time I had a QR code, but that QR code no longer works. So the book has been out a few years. There are still some copies left if you need, to make holiday purchases for someone who really, really loves their history. Next slide, please, Carla. This is an image of what Dr. George I. Sánchez looked like when he took his teaching job at the University of Texas in 1940. So while I say this, I want you to have this image in your mind. George I. Sánchez is probably the most important Mexican-American you've never heard about, or not heard enough about. It is my contention that there's a lot of credit to go around. There are a lot of civil rights leaders, women, men. George I. Sánchez is a different kind of civil rights leader. He speaks to a lot of aspects to our modern society and the issues that we value today. Next slide, please, Carl. George I. Sánchez's most important theme, his most important topic was education. He was a professor of education at the University of Texas for and was still teaching classes that spring semester when he passed, when he got sick for the final time and passed. Why is education important? Well, if you look here at the slide, the educational conditions in Texas, and these are aggregate statistics that basically come from the state, and you know the state doesn't like to make itself look bad, but the state actually published this in the late 1950s. Of Mexican-American children in state from the 1940s to the 1950s. Please come in.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. You're going to, okay.
Sorry.
Less than 10% of Mexican-American children got to the 12th grade and graduated. 4/5, and again, this is an underreporting of Mexican-American children in the state of Texas, in the public schools of the state of Texas, failed the first grade. Only a quarter made the 8th grade. Speaking Spanish was regarded by the state as, if you spoke Spanish as a native language, that was seen as having a Spanish language handicap. It was viewed as a kind of mental or educational disability. Segregated facilities through the 3rd grade. Next slide, Carla. This probably brings us to the most famous picture of a Mexican school in Texas history. Can you tell me who that middle figure is? It's a little blurry because I enlarged the image. I know Cynthia knows who it is. Jeremy? You don't? Cynthia, why don't you tell us?
LBJ.
It's Lyndon Johnson. That is LBJ in the middle with his students at the segregated Mexican school of Wellhausen Elementary in Cotulla, Texas in 1925. Probably most important to remember that LBJ kids, he only taught for a couple years. You know, he gave his heart and soul into it, but he was only there a couple years. He had other things in his life he wanted to accomplish. He loved his kids. He sacrificed a big chunk of his first paycheck to buy toothbrushes and toothpaste for his kids because he realized when he got there that they didn't have things like that. He pushed his kids. He pushed them to compete in speech competitions and all kinds of UIL activities that they didn't feel like they had a right to participate in, and he insisted that they do. He bucked the school board by insisting that they participate in extracurricular activities. He bought playground equipment. He was a wonderful teacher. And most of his biographers credit LBJ with, this is what humanized him. This is what created, this is the impetus for the Great Society of the 1960s, the anti-poverty programs, the education programs. It's also important to remember, he taught in an English-only manner. When his kids, these kids that he loved so much, when they spoke Spanish, a part of his love for them was doing exactly what the state curriculum insists that he do. Corporal punishment for children that spoke Spanish in the classroom. He would ask the kids that violate this, the boys mostly, he would ask them to go outside to the playground where there was a little tree, a little elm tree. They would cut little tiny branches and he would whittle them off to make switches. That was the best kind of teacher Mexican Americans could get in Texas in the 1920s. And that's what it was like. That gives you a sense of what educational conditions were like. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you that backdrop before talking about George I. Sánchez proper, the real subject of today. He was a New Mexican. This is how he looked when he was in his 20s and 30s. Very guapo. You know, you can see the very Clark Gable mustache that was very popular back in that day. He's got the curly hair, smoky eyes, all that good stuff. Next slide, please. His father was a miner. His mother was a homemaker. So his father bounced from mine to mine to mine. He worked a lot of copper mines in Arizona. So the family migrated from Albuquerque, really Barelas, which is kind of a little colonia outside of Albuquerque. And they would migrate to Jerome, Arizona, where there were mines. They would migrate to Winslow, Arizona for a while. The father was usually underemployed. The family was very poor. George recalls that he and his brother would cruise by trash cans after school looking for anything that might be thrown away that they could use for their family, because it would all go into the pot and it would all become a stew, because that's all they had. The family moved back to Albuquerque. He was a very good student. His brothers were too. And he graduated from the age of 16 at Albuquerque High School. Yeah, back then, you know, a lot of high schools only went to about the 10th or 11th grade, but that was still very impressive. There was no failures for him. He really was one of the fortunate ones, one of the exceptional ones that kind of got through this very racist and very oppressive kind of public school system. He started teaching at 23 when he was 16. He started teaching in rural Hispano schools throughout the Albuquerque area, in the hills of Bernalillo County, all around there. He taught on reservation lands. He taught to cedar choppers up in the hills and the mountains. He taught in the local, like in the city proper. He met a girl, he married, and he began to start a family there in the late 1920s. And he did something else. Back then, especially with rural teachers, they would get college credit for doing continuing education courses in the summer, over the weekends, sometimes by correspondence. George I. Sánchez basically finished his junior and senior year as an education major part-time while he was teaching in the New Mexico schools. So much so that by the time the late 1920s rolled around, he figured, you know, all I have to do is the basic 101 courses, the intro-level courses, the core curriculum courses, and I can finish. And he did. He finished with a bachelor's degree in 1930 from the University of New Mexico without ever attending regular semester classes as a full-time student. I mean, that's hard to do now. A lot of kids work now, a lot of young men and women work now, and they try to get their degrees part-time. That's hard to do now. Back then, it was next to impossible, and he did it. He took a year to get a master's degree at the University of Texas in 1931. He worked for the New Mexico State Department of Education as a very crusading statistics division chief while he was getting his PhD at Berkeley, Cal Berkeley, which he got in 1934. Next slide, please. He entered Texas in 1940, and he had one normal year of teaching at Texas before World War II hit. So by 1941, World War II hit, and he became very active in his university's response to the war. You can see him right here at the edge of the table, looking very thin and very gaunt. I'll talk about that here in a minute, at a Good Neighbor academic meeting designed to promote basically relationships between American universities and Latin American universities as part of the war effort. Next slide, please. He did a lot of things during the war. He published a series of textbooks which involved Carlos Castañeda, his colleague at the University of Texas. He published books, he published articles on Mexican higher education. He headed his university's Good Neighbor Committee. While he was doing all of these things, he was working part-time for the Office of Civilian Defense. That was a lot. As you can imagine, he was not home very much. He and his spouse separate in 1943. She goes back to New Mexico. He stays at UT. He actually takes a job for Nelson Rockefeller in Washington, D.C. as the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. He worked with Walt Disney, making movies for Latin America in that brief time in 1943-44. Next slide, please. However, this all came crashing down. He was working too hard. He was not taking care of himself. He didn't have anyone in his life anymore after he separated from his wife to really remind him to take care of himself. He overworked himself, and he eventually got tuberculosis. He probably had it from when he was a child. He probably picked it up from his parents. They probably picked it up in the mining camps, but it got really exacerbated. And shortly after he took his job with the CIAA, the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, he got so sick that he ended up spending a year in a hospital bed in Washington, D.C. from early 1944 to early 1945. At this time, he was still separated from his spouse. The year before, he had tried to get a commission in the Navy and was refused. Generally speaking, when you wanted to get into the war, there's always an intelligence posting or a paperwork kind of thing that they could do. The services were in dire need for that. But the correspondence that I've reviewed indicates very clearly to me that the response that he got was, someone like you shouldn't be an officer in our Navy. And that's what he was going for. He wasn't trying to be like an enlisted ensign or anything like that. He was trying to go in as an officer like other academics did. A lot of drama with the university over his divorce. He was denied pay raises. I did want you to know that he does kind of reboot his life. Next slide, please. By 1946, he remarries, and by the late 1940s, he becomes a grandfather. And whatever failings George I. Sánchez had as a husband, and he had them, whatever failings he had as a father, I think he had them there too. He was a great granddad. His grandchildren uniformly remember him as a loving, caring, funny, irascible character that when he left their lives, they were just really shaken up. That's a picture of him with his first grandson, Mark, and the dog, whose name I used to remember. I don't remember that anymore. And his second wife, Luisa Guerrero, who was a school teacher and was a graduate student at the University of Texas. She eventually got her PhD in Spanish and Spanish language teaching, and shared his life for the rest of his life. So he did kind of, after that bad period during the war where he seemed to just sort of lay everything on the line, he did recover. Next slide. Now the 1950s it's an interesting time in civil rights. This is where things are popping in the 30s and the 40s, obviously, but things really come to a head in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, even though he was slowed down physically, so his treatment for tuberculosis, he caught it. Had he caught tuberculosis a few years later, amoxicillin, it would have wiped it out. I mean, there would have been an antibiotic available for it. They didn't have that quite yet. They were still experimenting with that. So the treatment that he got for his tuberculosis was, he had one side that was really infected. So what they did is they severed it. And they stuffed porcelain balls inside the lung, and they cut the lung and severed it so that the lung would collapse. So he basically had to operate on one lung the rest of his life. So if you see pictures of him, a lot of times you'll see pictures of someone like this. That's because part of right here that was supposed to be there was missing, and he usually had to walk with a cane. He had to, especially if steps were involved, he had to get special parking. And yet, with all of this is a good time to say, you know what, I'm just going to kick back. I'm going to enjoy my life. I've done my bit. I worked really hard. I tried. I'm just going to enjoy my classes and just live it. He actually, in the 1950s, he writes a colleague, and I didn't include this quote here. I cut out most of the quotes. I saved one for the end because I want to end with it. But he told a colleague, the segregated school, if I could get the segregated school, if I could fix that, if I could solve it, if I could do something about that, that's my legacy. That's my life. He forms the American Council of Spanish. Most of you have never heard of ACSSP, and that's okay. There's no reason for you to know about the American Council of Spanish-Speaking People. It was a failed effort. It did not succeed. Well, okay, Cynthia's, I know what you mean. It was failed in the sense that it did not last. It had tremendous successes. It did. It was essentially MALDEF. That's what it was. He was trying, so Sánchez in the background, next slide please. Sánchez in the background was organizing, he was fundraising, he was putting together these lawyers, these academics and intellectuals, these public officials from all over the Southwest to basically collaborate and pool their talents to be able to hire top-rate attorneys with a grant from the ACLU. He was able to do this, and they financed several school cases. One is the Hernandez v. Texas case, which we just talked, we passed a little while ago. There's a few school cases here that the last two cases, Delgado v. Bastrop and Hernandez v. Texas, Sánchez was directly involved in. He was sort of on the sidelines for Westminster. All of these cases, Salvatierra was in a state court. Mendez v. Westminster was in a California federal court. The other two were in Texas federal courts. In every single one of these cases, 1930, 1947, 1948, 1957, every single one of these cases, they won. They won. Mexican Americans won. They got judges to declare that racial segregation was illegal and that the school districts were doing exactly that and that they shouldn't do it anymore. They were also lost. And what do I mean by that? Before Brown v. Board, at that time, and even a little after Brown v. Board, the federal courts did not want to be in the business of telling schools how to do their job. So they declared things were illegal, and then they told the plaintiffs and they told the school districts, you two work it out. So what happens is that the school districts double down on the scientific evidence that Spanish-speaking children were functionally educationally retarded. That would be the word that they use. That was the official word that they used, that there was educational retardation that Spanish speakers had that demanded that they have special classes, special curriculum, special teachers, maybe in a separate part of town too. So the words changed, but the beat stayed the same. It's still the same old song. It's the same kind of oppressive experience, even though you have these several victories. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of Sánchez in between two civil rights titans. On the right, you have Dr. Hector P. Garcia. Dr. Hector P. Garcia was the founder of the American Gender Forum from Corpus Christi and a physician. Gus Garcia was the famed, flamboyant, tremendously eloquent attorney from here in San Antonio. And George Sánchez was in the middle. They were involved in most of these cases. And in fact, a special note about Gustavo was arguing the Hernandez v. Texas case at the U.S. Supreme Court. Sánchez would write people later, you should have seen that. He was in rough shape the day before, but on that day, on that morning, he was just a lion. And the Supreme Court justices were dazzled by his arguments. And they kept trying to throw it, peppering him with all kinds of different questions. There were outright segregationists on that Supreme Court. And answer for everything, and a good answer for everything. And that was probably the highlight of his career. He had a lot of personal demons to Gus Garcia. But then again, I think most of these activists who struggled so mightily against this oppression for this cause, they all sacrificed personally. We've talked a little bit about Sánchez and how he sacrificed personally. That not everyone in his life could go with him on that journey because it was a hard, arduous journey. Same thing for Gus Garcia, same thing for Dr. Hector Garcia. So George I. Sánchez was sort of the organizer for a lot of the civil rights activity. He was involved in fundraising. In fact, his papers show that when he was still involved with LULAC, he would later get away from that organization. But in the late 1940s, George I. Sánchez was responsible for coordinating the income from every LULAC and barbecue and other kind of shindig designed to support money for the Delgado case. He organized expert witnesses. He was an expert witness himself. So Sánchez was really good about having academic conferences, which would involve experts from around the country who would essentially give papers about how this kind of segregation was really not very progressive. In fact, it was kind of backwards and it wasn't really scientific. And these are the people he would then bring to the attorneys to be expert witnesses. And for the record, the University of Texas Board of Regents did deny him salary on more than one occasion. In particular, after the 1957 Hernandez school segregation case, where a Board of Regents literally redlined his salary rates, saying, no, I don't like his politics.
Did he actually work for that period of time for them? And then they denied his salary?
Yeah. He was working at the University of Texas and they denied his salary increase. He was really about, and I think this is the thing that I want to focus on. There's a lot of activism here. There's a lot of activism on immigration. There's a lot of activism on academic freedom. There's a lot of activism on international relations. But at the core of Sánchez's activism was the segregated school. He really believed that academically challenging ideas that justified segregated schools would bring the Mexican American community through their children to their rightful place at the table that is this country. Their place in the table, no better, no worse than any other group's place. Next slide, please, Carla. In the 1960s, Professor Sánchez began to get older. He was still involved in politics. He was a big administration and the Peace Corps. We sometimes forget that he was also an international scholar. He had big academic ties to Mexico, to Venezuela, to Peru, to Puerto Rico, and on that basis, he was instrumental to the Peace Corps when they first started out. He later got into an argument with Sergeant Shriver, and he wasn't on the board anymore, but he was on several boards for Lyndon Johnson. He became a kind of a grandfather figure to the Chicano movement of the 1960s. Next slide, please, Carla.
1950s?
60s.
60s.
So when the Chicano movement hit in the 1960s, there he is, right there. You could see he's getting a little older. You could see the slump that be able to see that he's got his kid with him, that stick he needs to walk, because they're walking up the steps of the Capitol, and he couldn't make it up the steps without the cane. This is La Marcha. This is the UFW march from the Rio Grande Valley all the way up to Austin. This is the march where Governor John Connally and Lieutenant Governor Ben Barnes pulled over and stopped the march, like in New Braunfels before they got there, right? They stopped the march to basically tell the marchers, you don't want to go to Austin. There's no reason for you to go to Austin. Just talk to us here. We'll settle this. And the marchers were like, oh, no, we're going to finish this march. So big rallies. They have a lot of allies. Sánchez was one of the contingent of people that met them at the steps of the Capitol. You can see several allies here, some of them looking away from the picture, some of them shielding their face from the camera.
The gentleman next to him is Judge Alfred Hernandez, who is National League President.
Is that Judge Hernandez? Wow. At one point, the archivist at the University of Texas speculated that the gentleman averting his face was Jim Baker, because it kind of looks like him. And I thought, no, Jim Baker would never be caught in a UFW. No. The leading theory is that it may actually be John Connally's. It may actually be John Connally's brother, who was a state senator at the time, who was a little more liberal theory. But at this point, he was very much an older figure. He would give talks about terms of identity. You know, by the end of his life, unlike a lot of Mexican Americans from that generation, he really embraced Chicano. He thought, yeah, Chicano's great. Call me a Chicano. I'm all of the things that go into Chicano. It's also, I'm Mexican American, I'm Hispanic, I'm Latino, I'm all of these things. I'm an American, that aspect of his identity. Next slide, please, Carla. Jorge Sánchez died in 1972. His body basically gave out on him. I mean, the liver in particular gave out on him, but there were a lot of other parts. He had been in ill health for many, many years. And he had a doctor, a Navy doctor, in Bethesda, where he was in the hospital during the war, had told him that he would be lucky if he lived 5-10 years. And he lived a long time after that, the whole time. I think his greatest achievement, was defending the ability of Mexican American children. The idea that, yes, there are problems out in the world, but this group of kids is just as capable as any other group of kids, seeking respect for Mexican Americans' contributions, doggedly, and I mean doggedly fighting for integration in all things. By the end of his life, you know, he wasn't getting around very well anymore, but he was highly active in all of those young Chicanos that at the University of Texas studies that were trying to advocate for greater representation on campus. And he saw this not as a rupture from the work that he was doing in the 1920s and 30s. He saw this as the next step, as a continuation of that. So in that sense, I know that, you know, with a lot of, when we talk about the Mexican American generation and the Chicano generation, we can sometimes emphasize content, sometimes emphasize. But even though there are differences, there are things about the young kids that he was not all right about, you know. For the most part, he thought the kids were all right and that the kids were doing a great job. and that if he was young, he would be with them marching, and he would be with them with this new kind of activism, where brownness is celebrated, brownness is beautiful, where is not just from the Mexican American body politic, where the immigrant and the Mexican American citizen and non-citizen alike, are together in the struggle.
Did he have trouble getting tenure because of his philosophy?
He came in with tenure.
Okay.
He came in with tenure, and that's why he never lost. That's why he never got denied it. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, he had a lot of publications. So his publications were such that he came in as a full professor in 1940. Even though he didn't have that title at the University of New Mexico, he had published so much that he really did. He was able to use that. Had he not had tenure, I think he would have been denied tenure in the 1950s. George I. Sánchez believed that racism and oppression and discrimination. He wanted to realize all our potential to contribute to this society and to mankind. This is the only quote I'm going to give you. This is the only one I left in here. Next slide, please, Carla. And I'm going to read this. Now, I can't read it in George I. Sanchez's voice. That man had a deep voice. I mean, I can't do that. He had, for a little bitty guy, the voice was, he had a beautiful voice. We need to look upon our American minorities objectively. And when we do so, we will find that much that we think of as due to ethnic or racial differences are products of the state of mind, the diseased state of mind, not that of the minority group. Jim Crowism, whether practiced against Negro, Jew, Mexican, or Chinese, is a mass mental aberration, a disease of which we must be cured for our own sake. Only because, from my point of view, the so-called problem of American minorities is, in reality, the problem of the majority. Next slide, please. And he would have looked like that, delivering that talk. I wanted to finish with that image because that sense that this was a larger crusade, this was a moral crusade, was a part of his life, and that crusading nature was a part of all his scholarship. Whether he was writing about Peru or Mexico, whether he was writing history about the old Spanish bishops and how they trained priests, whether he's writing about migrant conditions, whether he's writing about anything, really talking about that possibility was in all of us. And so this is a talk that he gave in the 1950s at about the time that he wrote those words. And this happy, joyous sense of speaking truth to power is what he embraced his whole life and his whole career. And I have found that idea in the talk, that write a biography, you really get into someone's mind. You know, you try to, we can never see everything, but we try to imagine and we try to inhabit their space. And that joyfulness, we don't always associate joyfulness with fighting, but he had it. If you can have both, he had it, and that's what it looks like. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening to.
I'd like to make a comment that
Sure.
about 1977, Antonio Rendain organized a march from the Valley to Austin to talk about forming a union for Texas farm workers. Cesar was doing his thing in California, and Antonio was doing his thing here with Texas farm workers. So it was there was conflict because Cesar Chavez wanted to get us to give him my first job was in the farm, in the fields, working in the fields, South Texas. So I marched with them from San Antonio to Austin in '77 to appeal to Governor Briscoe about the situation, and we were totally denied. So he organized a march to go all the way to Washington. So these people walked from Texas all the way to Washington, D.C., and got the same results. They didn't get anything. So all we got, Steve Jordan wrote a song about it, about La Marcha de la Historia, to commemorate that effort of the Texas farm workers to change things for the Chicanos here in Texas. And it didn't work, but he would be pleased to know that the effort was still in effect, that Raza was still organizing to make change. I just want to make that comment to you. I don't know if you know about Antonio Orendain, but you could write a book about him.
Yeah. No, and I've heard about the march, but I didn't know those details. Thank you for telling me.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I went from here to Austin. I couldn't make it to the rest of it, but it was an experience to sit there with Governor Briscoe and him being so adamantly against the forming of a union for the farm workers. Yeah. And I don't remember his argument, but it paled against the rationale.
Yeah. Well, Briscoe was very hostile to farm workers and really Chicano activism. He used to call Crystal City Little Havana.
Yeah.
It's just,
yeah.
I mean...
Same old racista that controls still, and now it's even getting worse with some of the politicians on the Republican side of the aisle. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to take up too much, but I wanted to share that information with you about farm workers and the struggle for civil rights and wages. That I was making 50 cents an hour working in the fields. That's $4 a day.
Yeah.
Who can live on that?
Yeah.
I think we do have another question.
It's a kind of a conjoined question. So I attended UT Austin.
Those are the best kinds of questions. Yeah.
I did attend UT Austin from 2000 to 2004. Studied in CMA, so I got to see the project of the Center of Mexican Studies being completed. Took classes at the George A. Sánchez building, but I'd never heard about him. So I guess my question was, why do you think that he wasn't brought up as much? There's room, certainly, for more individuals to come to the forefront of all the efforts being done for Mexican civil rights. Why is he not discussed more? What do you think that holdback is?
I think that's a great question, because when he passed, he was not well treated by the administration. He was actually one of the lowest paid full professors in the entire university, with his publication record, which is really astounding. But within a decade of his passing, the UT administration's perception of his value changed. Ricardo Romo, the former president of UTSA, who at the time was a University of Texas history professor, was really involved with forming the committee that would get the University of Texas to honor him by naming the new education building after him. But from the reporting at the time, it seems pretty clear that someone in the administration said the quiet part out loud, and they said basically like, look, we really need to have a Hispanic name on the building. And it was really like a PR thing, but when you do that, it doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the university really changes its heart. And I think that's kind of the struggle. There is this illusion of inclusion. A great book written about San Antonio politics, right? There's this illusion of inclusion, but at the same time, that doesn't really solve the issues that those students were trying to address.
How did you come to choose to research him as opposed to any other civil rights?
I'm glad you asked that question. I was talking with Carla and Sarah about this a little bit earlier. When I wrote the first book on bilingual education in Texas, this guy Sánchez kept popping up in every chapter. You know, most people, they fit in one chapter because they do one thing. And Sánchez fit in every single chapter. I couldn't keep him out. It's like he kept butting in. You know, he just kept messing with me. And I thought, you know, if he's involved in all of this in so many different ways, I don't think there's a book about him. Maybe I should write a book about him.
Good for you.
And I kind of said that in a class. This is the first class I ever taught. I was in the Chicano and Latino Studies program at Portland State University in Oregon. My first job was in Oregon. And so I said that in the first semester of the first intro history course that I taught. And I had a student in the back said, because I was lecturing about the Mexican American generation, and I ended up talking about Sánchez the whole time because I knew so much from my work. And one kid in the back, and at the end, because I was lamenting that he's taken way too much time from this lecture, and I was apologizing to the students. I'm sorry. He did it again. He just kind of occupied my whole time. He took over. And the students said, well, why don't you write a book about him? And it just, like the light came on. Yeah.
I have another question. How do you think he would interpret the current governor's efforts to push a voucher system? How would he see that as impacting Mexican American children?
Yeah. I think he would have seen it as it's the same game. It's just a different part of that game. Like it just keeps going on and on.
Same monster, but with a different face.
Yeah. It was about keeping Mexican American children out of those public schools or marginalizing them from them, giving them a secondary place. But once they broke in, all of a sudden, well, maybe we don't need public education as much as we used to. So yeah, I think he would see that as a part of the same struggle.
I agree.
Yeah.
Dr. Blanton, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about his patriotism. You brought that up, but his patriotism, his involvement in the Good Neighbor policy, and then complicated by the fact that he is on the UT campus and is aware of the Chicano, not only aware of the Chicano movement, but in some ways supportive of it. Can you just describe his patriotism over time and how that influences his life, his work?
So his patriotism was very much a manifestation of his personality, which is he was a contrarian. He liked a good argument. He liked taking the opposite point of view. And for him, if you're not criticizing something, you don't really love it. You know, we criticize and try to make better the things that we love. And for him, his love of country wasn't about a narrow, this is what it is and this is what I love. He loved the dream of America. And he wanted America to live up to that dream.
Yeah.
And that was the constant struggle, forcing the country to live up to its aspirations and what it could be. And in that sense, it was unending. And I think he recognized that this was a struggle that would never end for him. It was just, he didn't see it as a burden, but he saw it as, well, sometimes he saw it as a burden, but he saw it as his calling, you know.
So he was 66 when he died. What happened when he died? The building was named after he died.
Yeah,
way
a
after.
decade later.
So at the time that he died, did his followers do something special in his honor? Or did he die quietly?
When he died quietly, surrounded by family. He was at St. David's Hospital, which is near UT. Is it St. David's? I think so. St. David's, I think. He was in that hospital near UT. His his liver was shot. I mean, he was in sepsis. He just wasn't going to come back, and so they sent him home. And so when he was home, you know, the grandkids would come in and spend time with him, and it was a very quiet thing, and he kept it quiet. So a lot of colleagues around the country didn't realize he had died because he didn't make his illness public. As far as he was concerned, I've been sick before, so I'll get through this. He really, in fact, I've got letters from him where he, Gonzalo Barrientos, I think his first run for like state house or state senate, he lost. But he and Sánchez were writing one another about, well, the next time I'll support you, and I'm under the weather right now, but you know, for the next election, I'll be a little more active, and I can't wait till I get out of this hospital and all that. He was never going to get out of that hospital. I think he was maybe a little delusional about that. But it was quiet after he died. I'll be honest with you, the initial response from his department was really negative. It was just sort of petty, you know, it wasn't very thoughtful at all. I think he'd been in that department so long that a lot of the younger professors, I think, just resented him, you know.
This was an undergraduate building or graduate? I got my PhD at UT.
Both.
Was it undergraduate?
So he taught both students, and he it was a program that was really designed for training teachers. So it was mostly undergraduate, but he did have a lot of graduate students, and his graduate students remembered him. His colleagues who had tremendous affection for him remembered him, and within a few years, the CMOS crowd at UT, mostly led by Paredes, would create a collection of essays in his honor, which led to a couple of buildings for him. There's one in the Department of Education building in Washington, D.C. There's a couple schools. But when UT did its thing, that was kind of in the mid-1980s and maybe late 1980s, and that was sort of it's an interesting thing because he didn't really have a lot of book or scholarship. He didn't have a book or a lot of scholarship written on him at the time, but he got his name on this building, and you know, like Castañeda got his name on the building because they wanted to honor these scholars. But the initial reaction was not that. There's no great outpouring of sadness from his colleagues. I found that interesting. I think over time, when you're that civil rights activist who's always pushing, but that's also hard on the people around you. Sometimes, you don't want to be around that person.
It's controversial.
Right. And he agitated about things, even little things. Oh, I saw one letter where he just went crazy, went off on his colleagues in a letter that he made available to the entire department because one of the assistant professors had passed along advertisements for Mexican schools. Like teachers wanted for Mexican schools, and he just went off on like, it's the 1960s, we fought these battles. How can you be contributing to this problem? And I think he's doing the right thing, but sometimes, people.
He did play the game.
Yeah. He was about righteousness, not about being liked.
Exactly.
Yeah. Jeremy?
I'm sort of interested in yours and Sarah's and Dr. Roscoe's, like, there's these folks that Alonso Perales and Garcia, like, that we're not hearing about, even those of us who get, involved in history and are so intrigued by these topics that live here in the area and stuff, where it's kind of like these conversations are frequently happening. What's similar about these characters that they end up the ones who don't get talked about? Because there's some that we hear about all the time, right? They're so frequently spoken about. But then there's these that you all have written about and brought these conversations forward. similar between them that's causing them to be kind of forced out until y'all have written these books?
I think in Sanchez's case, he's an academic, and academics we're weird people. We can be hard to relate to sometimes. The academic struggle within the ivory tower can be a little hard to communicate. Not everyone really knows what that's kind of an isolating thing for Sánchez, and so that was always going to be a barrier for him. At the time that he taught, academics were very well respected, but it was still him coming down from the mountain to talk to the local activists. And I think there's someone like Alonso Perales. I mean, that guy's at every barbecue, he's at every raffle, he's at every LULAC meeting, 1 and 2, right? The LULAC councils.
Yeah.
I mean, he's an attorney, so he is more of the people. And I think Alonso Perales probably, and he wrote for La Prensa all the time. He wrote advice columns. And so that makes him a more accessible figure. I think that's why Perales was always a more accessible figure, I think, maybe than Sánchez was. Cynthia?
I have some thoughts about that, and I would say that generally, I think that most of our professori are still influenced by the Chicano movement and are still ignoring what some of us are more broadly referring to as the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, dating back to the Order Sons of America here in San Antonio in the 20s, and LULAC from then on. And that's part of why you're not hearing still about people like Alonso Perales, Gus Garcia, so many, Adela Spento, other people. But also, I think unconsciously, and I read your book 5 years ago or whatever, why there was no chapter on George Sánchez as National LULAC president. And I was wondering, okay, did we once again erase the history and activism of LULAC, which is the key major organization that all these people connect to?
Well, and I can answer that just from a technical standpoint. There wasn't much in the papers.
But there was LULAC News.
True. There was
LULAC News.
He had very little in his collection, like private letters to other LULACers. I'm wondering if maybe the family culled some of that out before they donated. I heard that Mrs. Sánchez, this is a rumor, that she took some things out that were more personal related. And LULAC politics can be very personal. It was also at about the time that he was going through his separation with his wife. It was right before the separation. And I'm wondering if it got caught up. If this stuff is being taken out, if it got caught up with that, if it was happening at more or less the same time. But that was my defense, yeah.
And that's exactly why we need this Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, because these histories are missing from the textbooks, and we don't have enough knowledge about these key activists. So thank you for your book on Sánchez.
Well, anybody that would make it, be elected president of LULAC, he must have been liked. He's strong as a leader.
He had a very strong personality. But if you were around him long enough, there would be conflict. He had conflict with everyone he knew, But he's very charming, but give it a few years and, I didn't like that.
Well, he wasn't there to be liked, but he was there to create change.
Right.
What was his solidarity with the African American movement to desegregate schools?
So he was on the vanguard for that. His ACSSP, even before ACSSP got off the ground, he was already communicating with Thurgood Marshall privately. Like, look, so Thurgood Marshall communicated with him, he communicated with Thurgood Marshall, and what they were trying to do is figure out, how do your desegregation cases work versus how do ours work? Thurgood Marshall, at that point, NAA stopped trying with separate but equal, Plessy. At that point, by the 40s, they were moving towards challenging it, but they knew they needed to do it in small doses. Sort of build here, go up the ladder, right? And at one point, Thurgood Marshall was considering, in the late 40s, a test case in Hearne, out of Hearne, Texas, just on Highway 6, north of Bryan. And he was writing to Sánchez about that, like, you guys just succeeded. You succeeded in California a year ago, and you succeeded this year in Bastrop. Send me your stuff. And of course, Sánchez, sent him the stuff, and there was ACLU attorneys in between, and they get into this discussion about we're fighting different things. Mexican Americans, the segregation that they get is racist. Whereas with African Americans, they're just challenging separate but equal, right? So what Thurgood Marshall was thinking is that at some point we're going to win. He knew it. He knew it as late as the late 1940s. We're going to win. Brown v. Board was still years in the future, but he knew they were going to win. But he also knew, if we win, what are the schools going to do? Well, they're going to say that our kids need special until they come up to the white kids level. And that's what Mexican Americans are facing right now. So in that sense, there was a lot of discussion, there was a lot of cooperation, but if you're making different arguments, there's only so much you can do, right? By the time you get to the 1960s, it's a lot easier for the NAACP and MALDEF to work together. I mean, MALDEF comes out of the NAACP in part, but it's easier to do that because they're fighting essentially the same kind of argument. In an era where separate but equal is no longer the law of the land, you get all this softer kind of racial discrimination based on classification levels, personal taste and aesthetics, and that's what ends up being fought. The curricular battles really come in the 60s and the 1970s. But yeah, it's there. They're there, and they know one another.
Well, I think we have run out of time here, but thank you so much, Dr. Blanton, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody who joined us in person and online. I want to, one second, let me just finish. I also want to thank our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Bexar County, Wells Fargo, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Texas Historical Foundation, individual donors like you, and today's sponsor, AARP Texas. If you like today's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI by visiting our website at somosmacri.org. Also, did you know that we are building the nation's first Mexican-American Civil Rights History Museum? Yes, thank you. We need your support. We have a year-end fundraising goal of $15,000. We're currently about a third of the way there. You can visit our website at somosmacri.org to make a donation, to subscribe to our newsletter, which you can then share with your friends, or to find out about upcoming programming. Thank you so much for your support, and have a happy holiday, everyone. We'll see you after the new year.